Okay, so my name is Emily Dunkler, and I'm going to present to you guys American women's fashion and how it changed, and one of the reasons why I believe that it did. Alright, so my thesis, I guess it didn't get put on there, is women's fashion changed so drastically throughout American history due to the fact that women went from bread makers to breadwinners. Their clothes that were suitable for housework were not suitable for the workplace. Basically how my slides work is I'm going to have like the centuries and then the decades that like what the work was during this time period, and then the fashion that like women wore during that time to like help it make it be possible. So in the 1700s, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich wrote the article 3 Inventories and 3 Households, and she kind of explained like what the housewife's domain was, which was, she talked about, she was the one that had the quote about if you draw a circle around a woman's domain, it would encircle the kitchen and have appendages in the cellars, pantries, washrooms, and places of like that, of those types of sort. And it also would have, and that was just inside the house, and then outside the house it would include the garden, pig pen, hen house, orchard, and other places of like the outside source. And then she said, a wife who knew how to manage the ticklish chemical processes which changed milk into cheese and meal into bread, malt into beer, and flesh into bacon was a valuable asset, meaning that like women that knew how to do these types of things were like highly praised among men and were like sought after for wives. The fashion of this time, there was like some fashion that was extremely helpful to women that like helped made their housework easier, and then some that made it not quite so easy. One fashion that was making it easier was the pocket. It was kind of like what we would consider a small purse today. It was tied around with ribbon, and it was put on over top of the stays, which is like a corset, and then it was underneath the petticoat, which is like a skirt. And it was just kind of like really small, and it held like little tiny trinkets like a sewing kit or like buttons or something that she would need throughout the day, or if she had something that she wanted to keep close to her or with her at all times, she could have it in there. One item of clothing that she wore that might not have benefited her work but actually made it a lot harder was the hooped petticoat, which you can see in this image. It's, according to Erin Mackey, she said it's a huge, complex, expensive, immuring the body. The hoop seems a kind of cage that traps women. You can kind of see, like, just from that quote alone, how it kind of hindered women's work and made their work more difficult for this time period. I called it husband bait because it kind of, women for that time period were chosen by men not only for their family's financial stability, but also for how well they were able to give birth to children. And one sign of being able to give birth to children pretty well was large hips. So the hoop petticoat made it so that these women had large hips, which kind of made it like, oh, well, she's really good at bearing children, so I want her as a wife, which wasn't necessarily the case. So, and then a petticoat was just like a skirt, and since it was like there was no whole house heating at that time, they kind of wore them like they would layer a bunch of different ones to like be more warm throughout the winter. And they also did not have very good hygiene at all. They would oftentimes go multiple months without washing their hair. So since they went so long without washing their hair, they oftentimes most of the time kept it tied up, and then they wore a cap over it to hide how disgusting and dirty it was. And then their shoes, they also didn't have a left or a right foot. It was just kind of like a universal shoe that you just kind of had to wear until one side was destined for the one foot. Okay, and so then in the 1800s, the work was really similar to what it was for women in the 1700s, but they started adding like special crafts to their everyday routines, such as soap making. But they also gave some of the things that they used to do outside, they kind of like designated those more towards men so that they didn't have to quite focus so outside, and they were starting to focus more inside of the house. And in the 1800s, young unmarried women started going to the textile mills, and the young unmarried women were the ones that were picked because they didn't have husbands or children yet, so they were focusing on work and not their families that they had back at home. Fashion during this time, we had drawers, which was an undergarment with legs that covers the lower part of the body, and chemise, which is a woman's loose-fitting shirt-like undergarment. It's kind of like shorts and like a tank top style thing that acted as like a broad underwear during that time. And then the gowns during this time, as you can see by that picture, they were like pretty plain. They had no lace and no ruffles. They had a pretty high waist, and they had like a narrow skirt, whereas before their skirts were kind of fuller. Now they were just pretty straight down, and they stopped wearing the petticoat altogether in the 1800s. And they also stopped wearing the stays, which was a corset-like type thing, and they started wearing actual corsets. And then they also started wearing earrings during this time, which you can see there. There's like a pear-shaped style, which was the most popular one. And then since it was like there's still no heating invented, that's what I'm looking for, they could add sleeves or shawls to their gowns and dresses that they wore to like make them more warm throughout the winter time, so they weren't freezing all the time. In the 1900s, I'm going to break this section up into decades, so we're just focusing on the 1900s now. There were new technologies invented that made housework easier for these women. So since homework was more easier, more women went to work in factories instead of staying at home and only focusing on their housework. And married women were still staying home, but more single women were going to factories. And then women also started going to more government meetings to try and earn the right to vote, because it was right about this time that women started pushing the movement for them to get the right to vote. And during this time, fashion became kind of like formal, like more sophisticated, and it kind of became more masculine as well. They combined the chemise and drawers into an all-in-one, which you can kind of see in that picture there. And then the shoes, they had a left and a right foot now, a thick heel, and then they had like different options for them as well, and you could button, lace, or slip them on, and they had styles that were below or just above the ankle if they wanted. So the shoes kind of like advanced during this time. And the skirts became floor length, where before they kind of hit at like the mid-ankle. Now they became floor length, and they wore these things called shirt waists, which is, you can kind of see it in the far picture there. It's kind of like a masculine shirt, like just a button-up dress shirt. And they were very starchy and stiff, and it kind of gave like that formal wear that they would wear to these meetings to like talk to the men or that were in charge of the government meetings. And then they also carried parasols, which were the umbrellas like you see in the picture. Okay. Then in the 1920s, single women got more jobs as teachers, librarians. They designed clothes, and they also became social workers during this time. Married women were still relying on their husbands as breadwinners. And the clothing that the single women started wearing started becoming like looser and more movable, and it started becoming more flowy because they were working in factories, so they needed their clothes to be more breathable and movable. And then this is also the era of the flapper, so I don't know if any of you are aware, like, know what that looks like, but the dresses were very flowy and loose. The modern bra was designed or introduced in the 1920s. It gave breasts shape as compared to the old bras that would like flatten boobs and make them non-existent. They started, another big trend during this time period was fur trimmed garments. They wore dresses and gowns and coats that all were trimmed with fur, like those were all the rage. Silk was also very popular during this time, like it signified being rich and like high class, and cotton started to be like not as important, like people stopped wearing cotton because it signified that you were poor and couldn't afford silk. And hair was also worn in a short bob style. As you can see, all of the women in this picture had short bob style hair, and all the dresses started to hit right about at the knee. In the 1940s, World War II had started, and they started making machinery and uniforms for the war, and they still took on their woman jobs and the male jobs as well, because the men were away at war. Click. In the early 1940s, it was kind of like reflecting the uniforms that they were making at work, and they were very square and military-like. They had shoulder pads and like cinched waists and those types of things. But then later in the 1940s, after the war ended, they started getting more feminine again, and the shoulders started rounding out, and they kind of became a little bit longer than what they had been before. And pants were also introduced in the 1940s. And in the 1960s, married women started entering into the workforce. And this was when women started realizing that men were getting paid more than them, so they started really fighting for the equal pay for equal work for equal pay. Birth control also came out during this time, and so women started taking control of their bodies, and they also started movements to end domestic violence and sexual harassment during this time. Fashion in this time was shift dresses, which is actually not either of those pictures. They had A-line skirts, they were sleeveless, and they had a higher waist. And then baby doll dresses, which is this one here. It had a rounded neck and really tight fitted waist. And then hot pants, which were like extremely short shorts. They all, like, the sophisticated woman had short hair that was kind of no longer than shoulder length, and it was typically curled under. And then there were also hippies during this time period, and they wore a lot of tie-dye, bell-bottoms, fringe vests, gypsy skirts, and they all had long hair, which the sophisticated women looked at as like completely like scandalous, and oh my gosh, how could women ever do that? And you can kind of see the difference between the two women there. And then in the 1980s, women started taking managerial jobs with men. They were lawyers, bankers, bartenders, and even butchers now. And then in the early 80s, there was no color. It was beige everything, just browns and beiges and absence of color. And then in the late 1980s, that was like the year of big hair and scarves and silk blouses, high-waisted jeans, and also in this year they had licensed character prints, which is kind of like what we see today now when you have like SpongeBob or Scooby-Doo printed things you can get. Back then, that was when this came out in the 1980s. And then belts, bracelets, and bangles also became a staple for everyday outfits. And then in the 2000s, women now can work just about the same job that a man can. In the early 2000s, they kind of got negative looks when they started working men jobs because it was still kind of frowned upon. But as it entered into the 2010s, like it was kind of just like, oh, okay, a woman's working a man job, no big deal, no, like, who really cares? And then for fashion, we kind of just like recycled a bunch of different fashion from other decades. We don't really have anything that hasn't been seen before in a previous decade. We have denim jackets, scarves, high-waisted jeans, and then for hair, like nothing's off limits. You can be colored, short, or curled under. I think that's the end of that. Yep. Okay, but for my conclusion, like dresses like have gone from being stiff and like hindering, and now they're loose and flowy. Like our clothes, like if you look around, like we're all just like wearing like loose clothing that we can all move in, when back then we wouldn't have been wearing that kind of clothing at all, and we would have been very strict and like kind of like held back and reformed to what we're doing. It just kind of shows that like clothing has made it possible for us to advance in the workplace, because now we can move around and do whatever we want. And I said the advancements that women's fashion made allowed women to be able to excel in the workplace and take their stand more appropriately for equal rights. And they're my sources.
Any questions for Emily? Okay, thank you.